Hi, I'm Stephen Carter from Portland, Oregon, and Seminary Dropout is supported by listeners like you and me. You should support the show like I did. It's easy. Just visit supportseminarydropout.com.
You're listening to Seminary Dropout, and I'm your host, Shane Blackshear. This week on the show, I'll talk with scholar and author John Stackhouse about his newest book, Need to Know, Vocation is the Heart of Christian Epistemology. We'll talk about some other fun stuff as well.
The more recent call to set up parallel, truly godly institutions that a lot of us associate with Mennonite thinkers like John Howard Yoder or innovative thinkers in some ways like Stanley Hauerwas. Ironically, that's what the fundamentalists did after the 1920s.
All this and more on this week's episode of Seminary Dropout. John G. Stackhouse Jr. is an award-winning scholar and public communicator who has spent years adventurously mapping out our complex cultural terrain, identifying both its worthy achievements and its zones of confusion. He collects research from a wide range of sources, corrects currently popular interpretations, and connects audiences with information and insight they can put immediately into practice. He is therefore a skilled guide in helping us chart a course through the prospects and impasses of modern society. And he does all this with a wit you'll find surprisingly refreshing in a scholar. Dr. Stackhouse, thanks so much for joining me today.
Good to be with you, Shane.
I want to talk a little bit about your upbringing, because you're raised first in England and then in Canada. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And you grew up in a Christian home, and your father was a surgeon, and your mother was first a school teacher and then a university professor. It seems like that took a lot of responsibility for the trajectory of your work, being raised in a household that was one Christian, but also having kind of intellectuals as parents.
Well, that is the way one could read those biographical details. On the other hand, both my parents were raised in homes that had really virtually no formal education at all. So my dad was the only one of his four siblings to go to university. My grandfather had been an insurance salesman, and they lived in a tiny working class place in central Ontario. And my mom was raised also by a fellow who sold insurance and did other kinds of things without even a high school education. And her family was too poor, actually, to send her to university so she could go to teacher's college, which back then was basically just 2 years of what they called normal school after high school. And she just married this young medical student, and they jumped about 3 social and economic classes over the course of their lifetime and mine. In fact, my mom went back to school. She got her BA the same year I got mine, and she got her MA the same year I got mine. So there was a sense in which my parents, however, were typical of the upwardly striving working class, middle class, petit bourgeoisie, who would bring Time Life books into our home, would have 4 different sets of encyclopedias, would have classical record sets and Harvard's great books on the shelves, even if nobody read them. And the sense was that this is what proper, civilized Christian people would do. So even if we certainly did not have highfalutin intellectual conversations around the dinner table, there was this atmosphere of self-improvement and of respect for the mind that I'm sure did, in fact, shape me pretty fundamentally.
I was watching an interview you gave, and you were talking about this idea that within Christianity, we've been given this dichotomy between a Christianity where we withdraw from society and create these alternative societies, churches, and we don't compromise and things like that, or we choose to attempt to take over culture for Jesus. And you are saying that you thought that there should be a different way, a third way between those. So I have gone in my life from that place where I thought that we were supposed to take over culture for Jesus and back to the place where I feel like establishing alternative communities is the way to go. But and I thought also, I have to say, I thought that was the third way that I had, because I felt like one was saying take over the culture for Jesus, and what that looks like is right-wing politics, and the other side was take over the culture for Jesus, and what that looks like is left-wing politics. And forgive me for speaking in American terms, but I don't think that's too far off for you to understand what I'm saying. But you articulated another way. What do you tell us about what you think that is and what that looks like?
Well, the option to take over the culture and make it Christian is actually quite closely related to the option of abandoning culture and setting up alternative cultures, which is why we see both strategies at different times in the career of American fundamentalism. We see, if we trace its roots back to American evangelicalism of the 19th century, evangelicals more or less ran America outside the elite in sort of the Northeast. And then they gradually and more obviously lost cultural influence at the end of the 19th century into the 20th. And the fundamentalist reaction is this horrified sense of having lost cultural dominance to liberals and worse. So you can either fight back, which they did, to try to take things over, take over denominations, take over missionary societies, take over universities and seminaries. And then when you lose, you withdraw and you set up alternative institutions, which they did in great numbers, as the work of George Marston and Joel Carpenter clearly show. So the more recent call to set up parallel, different, truly godly institutions that a lot of us associate with Mennonite thinkers like John Howard Yoder, or with innovative thinkers in some ways like Stanley Hauerwas, frankly, ironically, that's what the fundamentalists did after the 1920s, was set up a whole parallel set of cultures, of pure cultures, of truly godly Christian cultures, which were not going to be infected by the stains of the world. And what both of those outlooks have in common is a very strong sense that what is currently going on in the culture is pretty much bad. And so you either have to take it over for Jesus and make it right, or you have to abandon it to the devil and set up your own cultures. And what I'm suggesting is I think the world is a much more mixed place than that. I think that the culture of the United States today, like the culture of Canada or Australia or the UK, is a real mixed bag, or Jesus actually said a mixed field of weeds and good grain. For example, there's lots of what we might call leading cultural indicators that would suggest the United States, and we'll just keep using the American context. That's fine with me.
It's very Canadian of you to come on my terms and speak my language instead of me doing that for you. So I'll go ahead and thank you for that.
Oh, you're very welcome, of course. And my family of origin are all U.S. citizens. I speak fluent American. It's not a problem. In the U.S. today, there are lots of leading cultural indicators that would show that the United States is manifestly less Christian than it was in decades past in lots of different ways. However, there are also a lot of leading cultural indicators that it's actually more in line with biblical principles than it was 100 years ago, when evangelicals more or less felt they were still in charge of the culture, less and less so. But if you compare the United States today and go back 120 years, say to 1894, would you rather be a poor person in the United States today or in 1894? Would you rather be a black person today or in 1894? Would you rather be a woman today or in 1894? Would you rather be a handicapped person today or in 1894? I think as a general rule, the less you look and sound like me, the better it is for you today in America than it was 120 years ago. So I think we as Christians need to be properly discerning about the fact that the Holy Spirit's never not busy. He's always trying to get good things done. And he calls human beings from Genesis 1 forward to make shalom, to make the world better, to cultivate and to, in fact, subdue the world when it's bad. And whenever human beings are doing that, and human beings are always doing that, whether they name the name of Christ or not, when human beings are functioning properly, that's what we do. We do good science, we do good medicine, we build bridges that stay up, and we feed the poor, and we try to quell genocides. All of these are good things. And if we fail to remember all the good things that are going on and preoccupy ourselves with all the bad things that are, in fact, always going on too, then we opt for one of these two choices: take it over for Jesus or abandon it to the devil. And it seems to me instead that what we try to do, and frankly, this is what John Yoder and Stanley Hauerwas will say, I think, in their calmer moments. What we try to do is to coexist with our fellow human beings, keep making culture, keep trying to win them to the gospel as we can, without any expectations we're going to bring in the millennial kingdom. And one of the ways that we can do that best is indeed to set up churches, families, Christian institutions in which people can see the gospel working out, but not so separate from the world and not so condemning of the world that we make those institutions unwelcoming.
So I'm curious how different that is from. Do you think that, like you referred to Yoder and Hauerwas, do you think that would they agree with you in practice, or is there real difference in how that carries itself out?
As I say, I think because of the medium we're in, it is easy to overstate things, and I want to be careful because I enjoyed knowing John Yoder a little bit, and I enjoy knowing Stanley Hauerwas a little bit. And I'm very sympathetic to their point of view. In fact, I used to hold that point of view 20 years ago pretty strongly. I don't think we're very far apart on the sense of being culturally engaged. I don't think they want to be fundamentalist separatists. And part of what I said before could be understood as saying that. I don't think that's true. They do want Christians to be salt and light. They do want Christians to exercise positive, creative pressure on society and not just withdraw into enclaves. Where the clear, bright line is between us is that I am willing to mix it up as a Christian in areas that involve violence and coercion, and they're not. So I'm open to Christians being involved in politics and police work and military service and so on. And they would draw the line and say, no, a Christian can't be involved in anything that involves coercion. But otherwise, we would then disagree at secondary and tertiary levels about the wisest way to engage in this or that aspect of cultural engagement.
How do we keep, if we follow your model, how do we keep from being a tool of the empire, so to speak? Going along with the thinking of Yoder and Hauerwas, it still feels like it rests on us exercising our power over other people rather than operating from the margins of society like Christianity did for a long, long time.
Yes, in fact, John Yoder has a wonderfully provocative essay that in his book, Kingdom Ethics, I think, where he basically suggests that we should, as Christians, have a minority outlook even when we're not a minority. We should keep acting like one. And I think that's fascinating, and I also think it's irresponsible. I think that when you are given, in the providence of God, when the emperor becomes at least a token Christian like Constantine did, and when he promotes Christians, and when it becomes fashionable to be a Christian, and when in fact a significant number of Roman imperial citizens are Christians like they were in the 4th century, up and down the social scale all the way across the empire, you can keep acting like a minority, or you can say this is a new era. Our missions actually worked. I mean, what happens when evangelism actually works? What happens when actually most people are willing to call themselves Christians? Well, it's a new social challenge, and I think Oliver O'Donovan's right. To be for or against the Constantinian change is a little bit like being for or against the weather. Like you just have to kind of ride with it. I think it's even in that sense. I think O'Donovan's right at that level. But I'd also suggest that let's give the Holy Spirit some credit. I mean, presumably, not all of these conversions, or not even most of them, have been bogus. Or you're actually saying all these conversions are bogus, and in fact, only the true Christians are this tiny little faithful minority. Well, that's a very scary thing to say. All this apparently spiritual success is actually not of the Holy Spirit. So what happens when Christians of various degrees of faithfulness, to be sure, still control most of the votes and most of the dollars and most of the guns and most of the media in America today? Well, that's not the situation of the Apostolic Church. It's the situation of America in 2014. And I think it's much better for there to be Christians involved in the political process and in particularly the institutions that are going to decide what happens in Guantanamo Bay, what's going to actually happen in the CIA, what's going to actually happen in the darker places of American foreign policy and domestic policy. To say it's better if Christians remove themselves entirely from that and leave the sword entirely in the hands of God and non-Christians scares the crap out of me, actually. And I think, no, I'd rather try to equip Christians for the difficulty of, in fact, serving in the empire, like Daniel did, like Joseph did. In fact, it is interesting, the two figures in the Old Testament about which we have the most biographical detail, and yet nothing bad is ever said about them, are Joseph and Daniel, who collaborate with the major empires of their time. But they're collaborating because the alternative is death, and God doesn't call everybody to just go die. He calls us to make shalom as we can. It might cost us our lives. We do have to take up our crosses. But at the same time, until we're called upon to die, we're called upon to make a positive difference. And that's why what seems like such a lame title for my previous book is exactly what I really believe. We are to make the best of it. And that's what I think God calls us to do.
On this, and this is the last question I want to ask on this subject, and then we'll move on. I also heard you say in an interview, you were talking about this type of thing, and you said that we, as far as this goes, as far as our participation in politics and that kind of thing, that we have to ask ourselves, what is God's will for this? Instead of, if I were king of or queen of my country for a day, this is what would happen. And that those are very different questions to ask. I think my question is, how do we discern what the difference is from subject to subject?
Yeah. Well, it seems to me it's helpful to ask three questions rather than one or two. The first question would be, what would God like to happen in the new heavens and the new earth? Like, in other words, if Jesus has come back, what's the ideal? What's the Polaris, the North Star by which we steer? So in the world to come, what do we know about that? What do we know of the ethics of the kingdom? And that's great. And that's where I think our friends Yoder Harwas and lots of other ethicists as well help keep our standards appropriately high. Then secondly, though, I think the next question is, what would God want in the here and now, given that we're not in the New Jerusalem, we're not in the world to come? What would God's will actually be for today? So let me give you an example, a fairly trivial one, because that actually helps our blood pressure stay low. In the world to come, presumably one is not supposed to use gratuitously foul language. I'm not talking about blasphemy. I'm just talking about needlessly coarse language, right? So that I think we'd all agree is a bad thing. It's not beautiful. It's not good. It's not accurate. It's just lousy use of language. Okay. But in this particular era, I don't think God wants us then to make it a criminal offense, punishable by death, to use vulgar Anglo-Saxonisms. So there's a certain amount of liberty that God, in fact, a considerable amount of liberty that God expects us to give each other, that he gives to us in this era, that will not be an option in the era to come. So then the third question is, all right, well then what would God's ideal be for this era, for the penultimate era, as Bonhoeffer says? And then the third question is, well, what can I probably get in this situation, politically speaking? So I do think that bad language is a bad thing, but I'm in favor of free speech because it's better than the alternatives. On the other hand, what about blasphemy laws? Well, okay, even then I'm going to have to go with freedom of speech because I don't like what happens in other countries and other regimes when they have blasphemy laws. So I try to work through what the cultural possibilities are, not just the legislative ones, but the broader cultural possibilities. For instance, if I think this lousy use of language is a problem, then it would be great if I could encourage Christian screenwriters and Christian novelists and Christian comedians to show that you can still be popular and cool and satirical and edgy without resorting to this kind of crappy language. Like, that would be a positive cultural way of trying to make a difference without resorting to legislation and without trying to bring in the world to come. So that's the kind of tense and I hope creative sphere in which I'd like to see us exercise more imagination.
Yeah. So, but I think what I'm looking for in that, and I agree with everything that you said, but a rule to live by in that, I guess you should say, because with things like with things like homosexuality, I may or may not have traditional views about that, but that doesn't mean I think that it should be illegal, that gay marriage shouldn't be legal, because I do recognize, because frankly, my opinion on it is because I recognize that the world is not the kingdom and the kingdom is not the world. And so we allow those things. And then there's some other things that I think about that for the same reasons I find appalling, but yet I do think they should be illegal. And to be real honest with you, I don't know why I think one thing and not the other, honestly, other than it does not feel right or appropriate. Does that make sense?
Yes. And there is really no shortcut to working your way through difficult issues. The only way out of them is through them. You actually just have to do your homework. If a lot of what God calls us to do isn't conceptually difficult, and so most of the ethical decisions I face in a day, conceptually, that's not the problem. It's just whether I want to do it or not. It's a moral problem, not an intellectual one. But if you're going to dive into the thicket of difficult social policies, like the question of gay marriage, and I think is a difficult issue because there's a lot at stake and it's connected to a lot of other things. Let me show you what I mean by connected to a lot of other things. However a church or an individual decides on the question of the legalization of same-sex marriage, then you have to decide, well, are you going to make a noise about it? Are you going to go public with your opinion via which media and which occasion, in what way? What's that going to cost you in terms of the other good things that you might want to do? Are you going to be disqualified from certain fora in which you could testify to the gospel because you're going to be seen as a homophobe? So then do you keep quiet about the homosexual marriage in order to be able to preach the gospel? Billy Graham's faced this kind of challenge his whole career. Others of us face that challenge at a much lower scale. So that's the kind of trade-off. And it seems to me that as I read Bonhoeffer and I read others who challenge us to follow Jesus quite existentially, moment by moment, in these ethical quandaries, frankly, there's really no shortcut to the hard theological and ethical work that has to be done. And since most of us don't get a chance to do that for a living, we need to find the kinds of teachers who are going to do that work for us and challenge them to do the best work they can do. Because I just don't think we can all, and we should all try to figure all this stuff out by ourselves. I think instead God gives the church first apostles, pastors, teachers, evangelists to help the rest of us think well and then do our particular calling in the world.
Okay, let's move on. You recently published a new book, Need to Know, Vocation as the Heart of Christian Epistemology. It seems like this fits in kind of your milieu of humble apologetics. What prompted you to write that book? Where does it fit in with the body of your work?
Yes, well, just as I am fatter than I used to be, I guess I now have a body of work that I never used to have before. I hope that's good. But this book is the elaborate answer to a simple question that came to me when I was about 18 years old. I was a student at an undergraduate university here in Canada called Queen's University, involved with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, a form of student ministry. And we were told that if we were going to really be adult Christians, we needed to think Christianly about everything, not just about spiritual stuff. So we needed to think Christianly about history or politics or art. And this was the heyday of Francis Schaeffer and C.S. Lewis. And I bought the whole package. That's great. Absolutely. I want to think as a Christian. So good. I've read my Harry Blameyer's The Christian Mind. I've read other books like that. I want to develop a Christian mind. That's great. So what do I do? Like if I want to think about whom to vote for in the next election, or I want to think about whether I should buy a car and what car I should buy if I ever get a chance to do that, or I want to think about whether I should discipline my kids with spanking or not, or whatever. Like whatever I'm trying to think about, how do I do that in a Christian way? So I went to InterVarsity Press. I figured they must have 6 titles on the subject, and I couldn't find any. And I looked around the publishing world and couldn't find any, and I started asking questions into my graduate work and realized that, well, the answer is a comprehensive epistemology, a whole theory of knowledge. Like if I'm asking, how do I think as a Christian? Say, well, how do I think as a Christian? The discipline within philosophy that deals with that is epistemology. So 30-some years later, I now have an answer to my question and thought I would share it with others. And since I found a publisher who thought it was worth sharing, out comes this book.
Well, that is a really ambitious undertaking because, you could probably find, not probably, you could definitely find a book about how Christians should spend their money on things like cars, or if Christians should, in what way Christians should discipline their children, spanking or not. You kind of just bypassed all of that and said, well, here's how you think about everything under the sun.
Yep. Well, when you say it fits into the body of my work, I ask pretty simple questions, frankly. I mean, my first book, based on my doctoral dissertation, was on, who's my tribe? It's kind of family history. Who are Canadian evangelicals? Because I was pretty sure the textbooks in Canada weren't describing the people I knew. And so with the help of my doctoral advisor, I tackled the subject and in the providence of God, rewrote the textbooks. I mean, the textbooks in Canada now follow my interpretation because I think it's just closer to the truth about who evangelicals are. And my second book had to do with the problem of evil. And my third book, how do I give away my faith properly? And my fourth book was about how we should think about women and men in the church. And the fifth book was about, I don't know, what was it about? I got a couple books of essays in there as well. And then how do we live in the world? What's our calling to live in the world? That's making the best of it. And now the most prior question, and this book could have come much earlier, except I just didn't have my thinking solidified, and writing all the other books helped me keep thinking well about how to think. And I probably could have dithered about this book for another 20 years. I mean, it's not like it's all done and I've solved all these problems. But one of my mentors, and God has given me four intellectual mentors. I should be a lot smarter than I am because I have these four tremendous scholars who've given me of their time and of their care along the way. And one of them was a philosopher named Nicholas Wolterstorff. And Nick talked to me 2 or 3 years ago when he was in Vancouver, and we were having supper together, and he said, "What are you working on?" And I kind of embarrassedly told this great philosopher I was working on epistemology, and he wanted to know more about it, and I told him what I was doing, and I finally said, "Well, Nick, you should be writing this." He says, No, I do what I do, and you do what you do, and you can maybe help the theologians with their worries, so you go ahead and do this book. And I took it as a sign from God that this was the time to do it, because Nick's never been directed like that with me before, and I did have a sabbatical coming up, and so, as I say, I went to work, and the book seemed to please the readers, and that's all one can hope for. So I hope it's going to be helpful now.
I'm curious about when you're writing that, if you felt kind of a weight of responsibility, because as I mentioned, there are books that have told us what to think that kind of did the homework for us. It's just said, here's what a Christian does. Just do that. You don't have to think for yourself. But in essence, you're releasing Christians to have the freedom to make these decisions. And I just have to think that there's got to be a lot of weight of responsibility when you write something like that.
Well, I'm really glad I didn't talk to you before I started trying to write this. Or
let me say, I have no doubt that you did a fantastic job. We just don't trust each other as Christians very much with that kind of task.
No, I think it's quite an astute question. That's probably why I would have been intimidated by it. And I suppose that's true. I think that there's a couple of safeguards, I suppose, built into this. One is that there are a certain number of people who, like the vast majority, are not going to buy a 300-page book from Oxford University Press with the word epistemology in the title. So there's going to be a nice filter right there that's going to keep this from being any sort of grass fire, blasting through evangelicalism in North America. I'm quite confident.
So you got the automatic barrier to entry.
Yeah,
there.
Exactly. Yeah, the threshold's pretty high. This is part of my marketing genius, is to keep this book in the hands of the chosen few. And secondly, I think it's a good point, but part of what I say along the way in this book is how much we need each other and how very dangerous it is to think as a Christian and as an American Christian that I am free to make up my own mind, which is true, but that's usually a bad idea, to make up your own mind. I think all of us, in other words, have to think for ourselves, but we shouldn't think by ourselves. And part of what I want to get at here that makes it different from just generic analytical epistemology is the important social component to it, both in terms of the church and in terms of good communities to help us think well beyond the church, communities of science, communities of politics, communities of activism that we should enter and enjoy frankly, we should select with care so that we will think better about things.
That's good. It kind of reminds me of, I remember reading in Dallas Willard's book, Hearing God, and he was kind of anticipating a pastor reading what he wrote and then coming back to him and saying, isn't it very dangerous for everyone in my congregation to believe that they are hearing from God? His answer for that was, well, yeah, it's messy for sure, but it's better. It's better than us dictating to people how to think and what God says to them.
Yes, that's right. That there is no escaping the burden of freedom and the danger of being a responsible human being. And because the alternative is indeed to cede our individual responsibility to others and to fail to act like the responsible moral agents that God calls us to be.
I want to ask you a listener question that somebody submitted when I said that I was going to interview you. My friend Graham, who listens to the show, he said to you, could you comment on the difficulties associated with holding to conditional immortality within the context of evangelical academia, especially with filling the position previously held by J.I. Packer, who strongly advocated for the traditional view? Do you see the conversation moving forward since, in his words, the coming out of Fudge, Stott, Pinnock, Wenham, and others? So first, for those listening, there's a lot there. You, Dr. Stackhouse, hold the chair that was formerly held by J.R. Packer at Regent there, so that's what he's referring to. And then for those who don't know what conditionalism is, could you just briefly talk about that? And my own question, conditionalism and annihilationism, same thing or no?
Yeah, I think that a couple of things that can be sorted out from this interesting congeries of elements. One is that it is, strictly speaking, true that the chair I hold, the Sangwoo Yutong Chi professorship at Regent, was formerly held by my friend and colleague J.I. Packer. However, it's also true that subsequently another chair was endowed in the name of Jim Packer himself, and that's held by my colleague Hans Boersma. So there's a sense in which really Hans is more Jim's successor at Regent in the portfolio of historical and systematic theology. And my job now is more theology plus, theology and culture. So in other words, there's less here than meets the eye. It's not as if Regent College has had itself some kind of change, or that evangelicalism has had some kind of change just because John Stackhouse happens to sit in the chair that Jim Packer used to sit in. So my friends in the conditionalist movement enjoy making this point as if this is a really, exciting bellwether of things to change, but I don't think so. I was never asked about this in my interviews at Regent College, and most people wouldn't have a clue about what I think about the destiny of the lost to this day, even people who read my work, because I've hardly ever commented on it and hardly ever written about it. That's going to change. Zondervan has a new 4 Views of Hell book coming out, and they've asked me to write the chapter on this, so I will nail my colors to the mast over the next year, God willing. And I've written the foreword to a book, as you may know, called Rethinking Hell, which brings together a number of essays by a number of scholars, such as Howard Marshall and Richard Swinburne, Richard Bauckham, and other top-rate scholars, as well as others less well-known, to support this view. And the view itself has a few names, as you mentioned. Annihilationism is one of them. Conditionalism or conditional immortality is another. And at a recent conference, I suggested these are both, or all three of these are kind of lousy names. Annihilationism, because it sounds like God has to actually do something to kill human beings. And God doesn't do that. God allows us to experience the just deserts, and the wages of sin is death. There's no immortal soul for God to have to slay. We don't have that. And even conditional immortality is not a great term, partly because you have to always explain what it means, but also because it focuses on Christians. Christians get to be conditionally immortal, but the whole debate is about the fate of the lost, not about the condition of Christians. So over this conference I was at recently, we talked about a few terms, and I think one fellow, Doug Jacoby, suggested the term terminal punishment. And I liked that term. I'd suggested something else, but I think this term's better because it gets across the idea that everyone at the final resurrection stands before God. The books are opened. Those whose names are written in the book of life get to go on to the New Jerusalem. Those whose names do not appear in the book of life have their sins in the other books, presumably, that are opened. And the accounts are read out. And it seems to me the biblical logic is that we each then, if we're not Christians, not been saved by Jesus, suffer for our sins. Either Jesus suffers for your sins or you suffer for your sins. And if Jesus had to suffer, you have to suffer. So you do. But then once you've done that, you're done. You no longer are related to the source of life because you haven't given your life to God. So you are simply, as it were, rectifying the mess you've made. You're filling the hole that you've dug. You're paying the debt that you accrued. And then once that's done, you're done. And it seems to me this makes much more sense of the Bible's teaching. Edward Fudge's work, which is the seminal work on the subject called The Fire That Consumes, is a painstaking study of every conceivable verse in the Bible that deals with this. It's 400 pages. But Edward does the homework to show that in the Old Testament, by far, the overarching view is that when you're judged by God, you're blasted into bits. You're smoke. You're obliterated. It's like Sodom and Gomorrah. There's nothing left but smoke. And over again in the New Testament, reference is made to places like Sodom and Gomorrah. The lake of fire itself reminds us of that. And the idea that all this death, all this destruction, all this ending is actually not any of those things. It's actually everyone's kept alive to be tortured infinitely. You can't possibly, it seems to me, get that from the biblical text in either the Old or New Testament. You have to bring it to the text from a Hellenistic background and then see it there. So frankly, to me, the biblical case for the idea of terminal punishment, the idea that everybody is punished according to their due, some with many blows, some with few blows, so to speak, and then you're done, is about as clear a biblical teaching as there is. And at a recent conference, I was actually asked to prepare a paper, and I mused aloud for half an hour about why not everybody thinks this. Because there are various cultural reasons why, but I don't think they're good biblical reasons why. I really don't. So now, what will be interesting, of course, unfortunately, in some denominations, in some schools, they've written eternal torment into their statements of faith, and people can lose their jobs for not holding to this view. And that's just terribly unfortunate because there are just too many prominent evangelical theologians. John Stott's the most key example. But as I say, Richard Bauckham and Howard Marshall, Earl Ellis, Richard Swinburne, the philosopher, John Wenham, Michael Green, the evangelist. There's just too many of us. Well, I shouldn't say of us. Those guys are all my superiors. But even some of us small potatoes guys who hold differently and are undoubtedly evangelical. So we need to start loosening this up at least, if not changing our minds.
Yeah. When do you think that became a litmus test for whether someone was either an evangelical or at least a good evangelical?
I don't really know. I do know, though, that it was always assumed by the majority of Christians. It is in Calvin, it is in Luther, it is in Aquinas, it goes right back to Augustine. There are some early church fathers who don't hold that view. Irenaeus is among the most famous of those, Ignatius as well. But most after Augustine, it's a pretty strong consensus through most of church history. So I think, frankly, everybody just assumed that's what everybody else thought. And that's what made John Wenham's book, The Goodness of God, published in 1974, such a surprise. Here was an undoubtedly evangelical biblical scholar in England, not well known to us here in North America, but he was known well then, and publishes this book for InterVarsity Press and suggests this alternative. That was really the first book that kind of opened people's eyes and ears to this. Then Edward published his book in the early 80s, but it didn't have a strong publisher, and he himself didn't have a high profile. So it was John Stott's admission in the late 80s in his book with David Edwards, where Edwards kind of flushes him out and makes him declare himself. And the year after that, a bunch of American and other evangelicals get together at Trinity Divinity School to see if they can kind of, once again, and American evangelicals love doing this, getting together and stating, who's in and who's out and what's hot and what's not. And in the initial draft of the kind of creedal statement that was going to come out of this, they had eternal torment, and then they decided not to include it because that would put Stott beyond the pale, and no one was wanting to do that. So that was kind of the beginning of the very clear wedge opening up thought, at least in North America, on this question.
Do you feel like that we're moving away from that? I mean, I feel like I run into people all the time, and pastors and bloggers and things who hold to this view, whereas before I feel like I didn't really hear about it. It was kind of either you're a strict universalist or you hold to the quote unquote traditional view.
Yes. No, I think that frankly the generation I'm sort of in between. These older guys that I had read, most of whom have passed from the scene, they opened things up. People more my age, a little bit older, like Bauckham and Swinburne and Marshall, have carried it on. A few of us are carrying it on. So I'm in my 50s, but I think certainly among 40s, 30s, 20s, more and more people are just saying, why would I even want to believe in a God who tortures people forever if I don't have to? Now I will, at least I'll try if I have to. That's what a good biblical Christian would say. If that's what the Bible says, I'm going to do my best to believe it. But why would I want to? And now that I see that there is this alternative case that's not only plausible but probably convincing, why would I think anything else?
Yeah. Well, Dr. Stackhouse, I've had such a good time talking with you here.
It's been good to talk to you, Shane. I appreciate it.
This week I put out a call on my personal Facebook page for my friends to send me some stories. I'm working on a project. It's a huge project. You'll hear more about it in the future. I'm so excited about it. And it involves telling great stories, specifically stories of love. And so I want to crowdsource you, the listener, and ask for your submissions. I want your stories specifically of love. When someone has extended love to you, or you extended love to someone else, or maybe it's a story about a family member or a friend of yours who chose to love. We want to hear those stories. They can be big, they can be really small. The fact is, probably everyone has at least one of these stories that they could tell. I am in the business of collecting those right now. So if you would, in about 200 words or less, send me your story. Send it to my email, shane@shaneblackshear.com. And if you can't write that down, just get to my website and you can find my email from there. And send me those stories again. For right now, I just need it to be under 200 words. Just give me the gist of it, the main points. And then I'll follow up later if we decide to use the story. And I'll give you more details about what we're doing and why we're doing. But right now, what you need to know is, huge project, very important, and I need your stories of love. Okay, I need to thank one new supporter this week, William. William, thank you so much for your ongoing support of Seminary Dropout. Thank you. Also, I need to thank somebody who gave a review on iTunes, An Ordinary Guy. That's the screen name, An Ordinary Guy. Thank you, Ordinary Guy, for that wonderful review on iTunes. That means so much, and it keeps the show front and center. So please, if you haven't yet, go rate, review in iTunes and subscribe. In iTunes preferably, or your podcatcher of choice. If you do Stitcher or some other kind of podcatcher, please go rate, review, subscribe. It means so much. Okay, that's it for this week. Remember, the music you're listening to is by D.L. Rossi. He's amazing. Okay, stay tuned for another great episode next week of Seminary Dropout.